The Odyssey, Book 12, The Cattle of the Sun. So Odysseus has left the kingdom of the dead, and they put their ship out. They go back to Aeaea. They bury Elpenor with full funeral rites. And then it is time for Odysseus to get information about the next part of his journey, which way he is to go after he leaves Aeaea. And Circe gives him a lot of information. This is pretty important. On page 274 and 275, actually beginning on page 273, she says there are two ways that you can go. And then she proceeds to tell him that the first way is absolutely impossible and that he can't possibly make it if he does go that way. And this is the Clashing Rocks, the way of the Clashing Rocks. Only one ship has ever made it through there. And so she says that's basically a non-starter. You're not going to be able to go that way, so you have to go the other way, which will also present you a choice between two routes. And so this is beginning on page 273. I'm going to read all the way to halfway through page 275 and make some comments along the way. This is beginning at line 82. On the other side loom two enormous crags. One thrusts into the vaulting sky its jagged peak, hooded round with a dark cloud that never leaves. No clear, bright air can ever bathe its crown, not even in summer's heat or harvest time. No man on earth could scale it, mount its crest, not even with 20 hands and 20 feet for climbing, the rocks so smooth, like dressed and burnished stone. And halfway up that cliffside stands a fog-bound cavern, gaping west toward Erebus, realm of death and darkness. Past it, great Odysseus, you should steer your ship, not your sheep. You should steer your ship. And so she describes this awful place. It's a fog-bound cavern. It faces toward the house of the dead. And she says, that's the way you need to go. So this is ominous and forbidding. No rugged young archer could hit that yawning cave with a winged arrow shot from off the decks. Scylla lurks inside it, the yelping horror, yelping no louder than any suckling pup, but she's a grisly monster, I assure you. No one could look on her with any joy, not even a god who meets her face to face. She has 12 legs, all writhing, dangling down, and 6 long, swaying necks, a hideous head on each head barbed with a triple row of fangs, thick-set, packed tight, and armed to the hilt with black death. Holed up in the cavern's bowels from her waist down, she shoots out her heads out of that terrifying pit, angling right from her nest, wildly sweeping the reefs for dolphins, dogfish, or any bigger quarry she can drag from the thousands Amphitrite spawns in the groaning seas. No mariners yet can boast they've raced their ship past Scylla's lair without some mortal blow. With each of her heads, she snatches up a man from the dark, proud craft and whisks him off. So we get this horrible picture of a monster with 6 heads on long, swaying necks that can dart out of this cave and gobble up men, and no ship has ever raced past her without losing men. And yet, we keep in mind, this is where Circe tells Odysseus he needs to sail past. And so that makes us wonder, well, what's the other possibility? If that doesn't sound like a very good choice A, what about choice B? Well, she continues. The other crag is lower. You will see, Odysseus, though both lie side by side, an arrow shot apart. Atop it, a great fig tree rises, shaggy with leaves. Beneath it, awesome Charybdis gulps the dark water down. 3 times a day she vomits it up. 3 times she gulps it down. That terror. Don't be there when the whirlpool swallows down. Not even the earthquake god could save you from disaster. No, hug Scylla's crag. Sail on past her, top speed. Better by far to lose 6 men and keep your ship than lose your entire crew. So she says the way of the Charybdis is not a way that you can go, because if you're there when she sucks the whirlpool down, your ship will crash. And so the only way that you can really go is to try to race past Scylla and only lose 6 men instead of losing your whole ship, either by the clashing rocks or by the Charybdis. So he's really in a no-win situation. Sometimes you'll hear people say trapped between the Scylla and the Charybdis, and it means that both options are really bad. But Odysseus is not ready to just surrender that way. And he says, yes, but tell me the truth now, goddess, I protested. Deadly Charybdis, can't I possibly cut and run from her and still fight Scylla off when Scylla strikes my men? So he, thinking like a warrior, thinking like he would on the battlefield of Troy, is saying, can't I get through this without losing any men? Can't I ward off the Charybdis and still fight Scylla? Can't there be something done? So stubborn, the lovely goddess countered. Hell-bent yet again on battle and feats of arms? Can't you bow to the deathless gods themselves? And what Circe is telling Odysseus is, you're not in Troy anymore. You can't employ these strategic military tactics on monsters like the Charybdis and the Scylla. She says, Scylla's no mortal. She's an immortal devastation, terrible, savage, wild. No fighting her, no defense. Just flee the creature, that's the only way. Waste any time arming for battle beside her rock. I fear she'll lunge out again with all 6 of her heads and seize as many men. No, row for your lives. Invoke brute force, I tell you. Scylla's mother, she spawned her to scourge mankind. She can stop the monster's next attack. So she says, Scylla is immortal. You can't fight her. You can't do anything to her. And if you wait too long and you try, Scylla is going to get 12 men instead of just 6. And so this is where Odysseus has to think like he did in fighting against Polyphemus, where he has to outsmart the monsters, or he just plain has to be evasive. The tactics that he employed at Troy will not work. Okay. Then continuing on page 279, they are now on the island with the cattle of the sun god. And the good green island of the sun where Helios, Lord Hyperion, keeps his fine cattle broad in the brow and flocks of purebred sheep. And Odysseus does not want them to be there. He remembers Tiresias' prophecy and Circe's and says, this is not a place we need to be. We need to leave right now. And we get a glimpse of the mutiny of his men. Remember, Odysseus needs to keep his men in check, but we get a glimpse of oncoming mutiny. When Eurylochus, on page 280, this is at the very top, says, Eurylochus waded in at once with mutiny on his mind. You're a hard man, Odysseus. Your fighting spirit's stronger than ours. Your stamina never fails. You must be made of iron head to foot. Look, your crew's half dead with labor, starved for sleep, and you forbid us to set foot on land, this island here, washed by the waves, where we might catch a decent meal again. And so he appeals to Odysseus for them to stay, get a meal, get a good night's sleep, and then take off the next day. And everybody, there's a kind of a growing affirmation of Eurylochus's plan, and Odysseus knows that he's in trouble. This is a mutiny that's brewing. So skipping down to line 319. So Eurylochus urged, and shipmates cheered. Then I knew some power was brewing trouble for us. So I let fly with an anxious plea. Eurylochus, I'm one against all. The upper hand is yours. But swear me a binding oath, all here, that if we come on a herd of cattle or a fine flock of sheep, not one man among us, blind in his reckless ways, will slaughter an ox or ram. Just eat in peace, content with the food immortal Circe gave us. They quickly swore the oath that I required. So he makes them swear an oath that they won't harm the cattle or the sheep, and they all agree they want to eat their food, they want to stay on the island. Okay, everything seems like that should be okay at this point. On page 281, we find out that Zeus looses a rippling wind, a howling demonic gale shrouding over and thunderheads the earth and sea at once, and night swept down from the sky. And so they can't travel. They can't leave the island now that they're there. It's too windy. It's too dangerous. There's a storm around. But still, there is hope because Circe gave them a lot of food. And they could wait this out. They could just eat the food that Circe gave them and then leave and not harm the cattle of the sun or the sheep. But weeks go by, and eventually the food runs out. And so this is a bad situation, and we kind of know what's going to happen already. The men are running out of food. They're trying to get food on the island, but there isn't anything. And one day, Odysseus falls asleep. The gods basically put him over to sleep, and Eurylochus comes up with a plan. This is on page 281, beginning at line 365. As Eurylochus opened his fatal plan to friends, "Listen to me, my comrades, brothers in hardship. All ways of dying are hateful to us poor mortals. True, but to die of hunger, starve to death, that's the worst of all. So up with you now. Let's drive off the pick of Helios's sleek herds, slaughter them to the gods who rule the skies up there. If we ever make it home to Ithaca, native ground, erect at once a glorious temple to the sun god, line the walls with hordes of dazzling gifts. But if the sun, inflamed for his longhorn cattle, means to wreck our ship and the other gods pitch in, I'd rather die at sea with one deep gulp of death than die by inches on this desolate island here." So Eurylochus accepts that death may be a possibility if they eat the cattle of the sun, but he would rather drown in a minute than to, as he says, die by inches. And so he goes back on the oath that he made to Odysseus, and they circle the cattle and they eat the best of the cattle. So this is bad. But Odysseus is free from blame because he was asleep. He had warned the men. He is not complicit in the death of the cattle of the sun. And so they eat, and Helios, the sun god, finds out what happened, and he is angry, and he cries out on the bottom of page 282. He cries out, "Father Zeus, the rest of you blissless gods who never die, punish them all, that crew of Laertes' son Odysseus. What an outrage! They killed my cattle, the great joy of my heart. Day in, day out, when I climbed the starry skies, and when I wheeled back down from the heights to touch the earth once more. Unless they pay me back in blood for the butchery of my herds, down I go to the house of death and blaze among the dead." So in short, Helios, the sun god, threatens to quit. He threatens to quit blazing on the earth, and instead he will go down to the house of dead and he will blaze there. There will be no more sun on the earth. And of course, Zeus can't let this happen. And so Zeus replies to Helios and says, "Sun, you keep on shining among the deathless gods and mortal men across the good green earth. And as for the guilty ones, why, soon enough on the wine-dark sea, I'll hit their racing ship with a white-hot bolt. I'll tear it into splinters." And so Zeus is going to avenge the cattle of the sun for Helios. And the men begin to detect that there's a bad moon rising because they see, we've talked about this word, a portent. And a portent is a sign that has meaning. And the portent that they see, this is in the middle of page 283, "The cattle were dead already, and the gods soon showed us all some fateful signs." So another word for fateful signs is a portent. "The hides began to crawl. The meat, both raw and roasted, bellowed out on the spits, and we heard a noise like the moan of lowing oxen." So the cattle have been killed, and they've been cut up into meat, into steaks, and yet they continue bellowing out and they continue moaning. And so that's an ominous sign. And something somewhat similar will happen in Book 20 when the suitors are eating a meal in Odysseus's palace, where the meat will also kind of make its own sounds, even though it's dead and it's been cut up into steaks. Okay. And so then it's kind of predictable what happens. The men are finally able to leave. Zeus hits them with a white hot bolt. All the men die. Only Odysseus is able to scrabble onto a piece of the ship, and he bobs around. He actually floats back by the Scylla and the Charybdis. Fortunately, the Scylla does not see him, and he is able to survive the Charybdis, excuse me, by clinging to the leaves of that fig tree that were mentioned earlier. After his ship and everything has been sucked down into the whirlpool, he has to cling there and he has to wait for Charybdis to vomit it all back up. And then he is able to cling onto something. And then he drifts at sea. He says, I drifted along 9 days. On the 10th at night, the gods cast me up on Ogygia. And if you remember, we talked last week about that 9 and 10 pattern where you get 9 days or 9 years of the same thing, and then on the 10th something changes. And so he's cast up on Ogygia, which is Calypso's island. And then he says, why cover the same ground again? Just yesterday here at Hall I told you all the rest, you and your gracious wife. It goes against my grain to repeat a tale once told, and told so clearly. And we remember that for these 4 books, he has been giving a flashback and telling the people of Phaeacia what has happened to him before he washed up there. And so now he is, we're kind of back in the present day in Phaeacia, and they are going to be sending him back to Ithaca soon. We get, I talked before about a chiasm, what a chiasm is, where it's kind of a ladder structure with what happens on one side of the ladder parallels what happens on the other side of the ladder. And if you think about when they're at Aea, this is after the kingdom of the dead, he's with Circe, who is the dangerous queen, the dangerous witch with glossy braids. They go from there to the Scylla and the Charybdis, and then to the cattle of the sun god. And then after the cattle of the sun god, he is washed back by the Scylla and the Charybdis. This is the downside of the ladder. And then washes up on Calypso's island. And Calypso is parallel with Circe. They are both dangerous immortals. And they both consort with Odysseus. They both want him to stay with them. Although Circe, it's not quite as clear that she wants him to stay with her. And so that wraps up these exciting books 9 through 12. And now we're going to return to the main story in book 13, where he arrives back in Ithaca and doesn't quite recognize where he is at first. And this begins kind of part 2 of the Odyssey, where now he has to figure out, now that he is a broken man washed up at home and finds a world of pain in his house, how is he going to pay back those suitors? Is he going to be able to fight like he did at Troy? Probably not. He's only one man. Is he going to be able to outsmart them like he outsmarted the monsters? He's going to have to do something closer to that. And so we'll pick this up next week when we talk about him returning to Ithaca.